So get comfy. I don't have a computer and I have PowerPoints. So everything would be whiteboard. If you want to take notes, take notes. If you want to record, feel free to record. Whatever is easiest for you. Also, I'm not a physical therapist, so I have not to disappoint you. I really have much to teach you when it comes to terms of sport because that's your expertise. What I'm trying to do is just to show you what training for performance looks like. Because if you are into return to sport, well, the end of it is return to competition, return to perform. So if you know what that looks like, because sometimes I feel like, especially the way we used to teach it at USC, return to sport is a lot about metrics and numbers, like you need to make sure that you can jump X number of inches or run or hop or whatever. But those metrics are indicative of the level and the type of training that those athletes are supposed to do when they recover from an injury. So you need to be able to expose them to the same type of training that they do when they train to perform. So if I can show you what that looks like, where now you have a target, you can't really hit a target unless you're aiming for it. So at least if you know what you're preparing them for, that you can create your programs for return to play performance with a little bit more understanding of what the ultimate goal is. So we're going to focus a lot on performance, but we're going to do it in a way that once you kind of like highlight the main key elements of program design, you can reverse engineer your programs leading up to the same outcome. So hopefully that will help you. Any CSCS in the room? Anyone with experience in strength and conditioning? Okay. So if I were to ask you, so put yourself in my shoes for a second. You're a strength and conditioning coach, and you need to find, we call it strength and conditioning, but we do very little conditioning. We do a lot of strength training. They don't even teach conditioning at the MSc, which is a shame. But still, you're in the weight room, you're working with your athletes, patients, clients, whatever the case may be, and you're designing a very comprehensive training intervention that has some strength, some power, some hypertrophy, some injury prevention, whatever. What is the one thing, the one number that you need to make sure that changes over time with that training intervention? So what's your ultimate outcome? How do you measure success? Like, you create a training program, your athletes train for like 6, 8 weeks, 2 months, 3 months, and now you need to know if they are better athletes or not. What is that one number that needs to change? Anyone has a guess? That's going to be your starting point. What is that number? We're doing strength training.
Stimulus?
Yeah, but what's that? Like, let's say you're doing a pre and post test, and you want to make sure that you have a number that shows that whatever you did in the weight room worked, and now your athletes are better in the weight room, and they're probably going to be better on the field of play too. What would be that one number? 1 rep max?
3 rep max?
3 rep max? Well, that would assume that your ultimate goal is strength, which is deceiving. Power is what we're after. So our goal is to improve power. If we improve power, our chances of improving performance are much higher. And now I don't want to spend too much time working on power, but just the basics. How do we quantify power? How do we measure power?
Force times velocity.
Please, after today, never say force time velocity again. Because that is not how we quantify power. Power is work divided by time. And we need to start from there because in our industry, we tend to consider power as force time velocity. That's neuromuscular power. That's just looking at the neuromuscular system. But we can't forget there's time at the bottom, which means that the energy system plays just an equal role in determining your power output. If we think of power, we think someone jumping or someone lifting big weights. That's explosive power. That's neuromuscular power. But if we look at aerobic performance, VO2 is a measurement of aerobic power. Just this number is much bigger because now we're not thinking milliseconds, we're thinking minutes or even hours of effort. So as a result, the number is much smaller. Let me give an example so we can put some context to it, at least we have an idea of what we're looking at. Let's look at cycling, just because cyclometers are used quite often in research and lab setting. Have you ever done a Wingate test? Do you know what a Wingate test is? Yeah? What does that look like?
It's like you're on a bike, you're pedaling, and then depending on your weight, that's where the resistance you're ready for it, and then you warm up to it, and then you put like a 30-second, and you going as far.
So that's a 30 seconds effort, and it's all out. And that's a measurement of anaerobic power, still power nevertheless. What type of number do you get out of a Wingate test? How much power can an athlete produce on average? Anyone has like an idea of what the average power output is in a Wingate? Somewhere around 500 watts, if the athlete's good, trained. Now that's kind of like anaerobic power. That's right in between aerobic and ATP, CP energy system. If we take the same athlete and we look at the peak power output in that specific test, so the highest power produced in that test, that usually happens within the first 2 to 3 seconds. And the number is way, way bigger. We're looking at 1500 watts. If we take the same athlete and we ask that to prolong that effort for 20 minutes, which is usually referred to as an FTP test, which is very common in cycling, is the amount of power you're supposed to sustain for an hour, the number comes down to 150 watts. And that's for 60 minutes. So you see that as time gets smaller, the amount of power you can produce is much bigger. As time gets longer, the amount of power you can produce is much smaller. So we can't just ignore that time is in the equation because it plays a massive role. And when you go from strength to conditioning, conditioning is work capacity. Work capacity is how much power you can sustain over time. So unless you're aware of that metabolic component of it, you'll just be missing a big chunk of it when it matters more. So we can continue force time displacement, we can isolate displacement and time, and now we get force time velocity. So now we're not looking at time anymore, which kind of like forgot that exists. We're looking at just how much force your muscles are producing and how fast they're shortening. So we eliminate power, we no longer consider the metabolic component of it. This is just neuromuscular power or explosive power, which means that energy system is no longer going to be a limiting factor. We produce more power if we can produce more force and greater velocity. That's the end of it. That's what we're going to be focusing on. That's a number that we want to change in the weird. So everything we'll do as the goal of improving power, and we get there by increasing force and velocity. If we understand that, we're halfway there to be very successful at what we do. One more question for you. Do we train power or do we improve power? That sounds like a silly question, but it's a gigantic difference when it comes to finding papers that support this type of training. Because then, he knows, you go on Google Scholar or PubMed, and you look for how do I improve power, and you come out with very few references and very few studies, because we're technically not training power. Power is what we use to measure the outcome of our intervention. When we combine these two things together, what we're actually training is rate of force development. That's what we need to care about. If you guys want to learn about strength and conditioning, and being physical therapists, your starting point is much, much higher than the average strength and conditioning practitioner. You don't need to worry about this, you need to worry about this. If you can understand the literature, rate of force development, you unlock 90% of what you need to do to be a great practitioner. It's just very complex literature. It's very complex stuff, it's not simple. Okay, so let's look at some things to consider when we look at power. And I'm gonna show you two different graphs, a bigger one here and a smaller one here, just to have in the back of your mind. So we have both. Here we have force and velocity. So we're just combining the two to see how they interact with one another. And here we have force and time. We're gonna look at that in a second. Let's focus on this one first. So if I want to, like I said, our goal is rate of force development. To improve rate of force development, we need to work on force and velocity. And if we do that well, we're gonna improve power. So we want to understand how force and velocity interact in anything we do in the weight room. Everything we do has either a force stamp or a velocity stamp to it. We need to understand how those two metrics change. So if I put them on a graph like this one, what type of curve would I find? What's the normal force velocity profile you guys have learned in school? This physiology or intro to anatomy, I don't know, what you learn in class. What does that look like? Okay, so we expect to see something like this, right? Okay. What's the name of that curve? So if you're younger, you call it a force velocity profile. If you look at a little bit older textbook, that's called Hill's curve. From Archibald Vivian Hill, who won the Nobel Prize in 1923, because he's the first one that described the mechanics of muscle contraction. And it's the same one for 100 years and change. This graph doesn't tell you much about the overall mechanics of muscle contraction. It describes a change. If I pick any random point in time 1, and if I look at how much force I'm producing, and how much velocity I'm producing, this graph just tells me that I am the one deciding in what direction I'm moving. Do I want to move faster or do I want to move slower? Do I want to produce more force or I want to produce less force? And if I pick a direction, so let's say I want to go this way, so I want my athlete to move faster, and now my point is down here, well, my force will have to come down. So when velocity goes up, force comes down, and the other way around. Does that make sense? And that's key in what we do, what we program in the weight room. Why? Because every single point of this graph has a velocity associated to it and a force associated to it, which means that for every point, I can describe a power output. And if I don't know how much power I'm producing in the weight room, then I don't know what type of adaptation I'm eliciting. So far, so good? Everything makes sense? Okay. So if you try to do a force velocity profile nowadays, and we're going to do it in a few hours, you're not going to get this type of curve. It looks slightly different. Have you ever seen any force velocity profile done with a velocity-based training device or JP Moran, squat jump type protocols? What does that look like? It's not a curve. It's a straight line, right? It goes from here all the way down here. So same behavior, same relationship, is just a straight line. What's the difference between the two graphs? They're both equally correct. You find both in the literature. What's the difference? So Archibald Vivian Hill, about 100 years ago, tested his force velocity profile, so this curve, on a single joint movement. It was a bicep curve with a flying wheel. So that's all he had available. Before he studied, all we knew was like frog muscles, isolated frog muscles. It's the first one that actually did on human beings. If you were to test any other multi-joint movement, you get a straight line. I didn't say lift, I said movement. So a sprint looks like that. A jump looks like that if you go force velocity profile. A squat will look like that. A power clean will look like that. Anything that is multi-joint will give you more of a straight line. One thing also you guys need to be aware of. What's the name of that point at the top right there? That's where my force velocity line crosses the y-axis. So my velocity equals 0. What is the name of that point? Peak isometric force. Yeah? Now, if you go home and you don't trust what I teach you today, and you go and look at reference and studies, and you look at the effects of different training interventions on peak force, you're going to find very, very, very little amount of information. In fact, maybe if you're lucky, 5 to 10% of the entire literature on resistance training talks about peak isometric force. The remaining 90% of the literature uses different terminology, and you need to be aware of that, because if you don't know what you're looking for, you will never find it. So when you go home, you want to learn about the effects of velocity-based training on muscle, on force or power. If you Google velocity-based training and you try to associate it with peak isometric force, you're going to come out with no papers, 0. Because most papers don't measure peak isometric force. They measure something else that relates to force and strength, but they don't directly measure peak isometric force. So what are the other 3 key terms that you need to know to be able to find this information in the literature? What's another word for peak isometric force that doesn't even have the word force in it, but it's describing the same identical thing? Physical therapists should know that. At least one of those.
Max strength.
Yeah, but let's think about more like literature, though, like papers. If it's not force, what's the closest thing to force that we can test in a physical therapy setting? Torque. So one can be peak isometric torque. And the only difference with this one is that you're not going to find newtons. This is usually newtons. You're going to find newtons meter because now it's force at a distance. So you have angular displacement. And just to make sure that we're on the same page, torque and force are the same identical thing. It's whether I measure that in a multi-joint linear manner, so ground reaction force, or angular displacement, torque. But it's the same measurement, nothing changes, strength is strength. What's the second way we could refer to peak isometric force, which is the predominant keyword if you're looking at BFI type of studies. If you look at the effects of BFI on muscular strength, you're never going to find them talking about peak isometric force. So if you try to combine those two keywords, you're going to come out empty-handed. What's another term for force? 4 letters, an acronym. You guys must have seen that in school at some point in time. It can either be 3 or 4, but most commonly 4. MVIC, maximum voluntary isometric contraction. Describe the same identical thing. So you guys were lucky because we didn't do it this year, but last year we did an assignment on BFR, and I asked them to find evidence to prove that BFR improves muscular strength, or at least it's working towards improving muscular strength, and they couldn't find anything because they were looking at BFR and force. You don't find an association, but if you look at MVIC, you find plenty of evidence to support it. So they're describing the same thing. And the last one, so that you have it, at least you know it, it's wire max, which we're familiar with. It's technically not the same point because the wire max should be somewhere up here, close to the velocity 0, but not at velocity 0. But they are all very common in the literature, and they all associate closely to muscle cross-sectional area. So if once we transition to this graph, we'll understand that. Pay attention to this sentence now, just keep thinking about that. Hypertrophy training is not necessary to improve strength. However, muscle mass affects strength massively. That doesn't mean that we always need hypertrophy, but muscular cross-sectional area has a massive role in force development. Okay, let's move on. Any questions so far? Go for it.
Why 1 rep max instead of like isometric pull or something?
Well, the isometric pull is the exercise by which you can measure peak isometric force. So I can either do an isometric pull or an isometric squat.
Yeah.
Those are the exercises. But the number that you get out of it will be peak isometric force. The isometric
So 1 rep max?
1 rep max would be a back squat 1 rep
Yeah.
max, would be a deadlift 1 rep max,
Yeah.
your bench press 1 rep max, yes. An isometric midnight pull is a test that you need to get this number.
Okay.
Am I correct, Tom? Thank you. So it can be a squat, it can be any type of exercise. Okay? So now we know kind of like how these two qualities behave. What does it look like when I want to draw the power? How does power look like on that graph? How does power behave? What would I expect to see? Yeah, pretty close. I'll have a curve that looks like this. That's my power curve. And there's going to be a point here at the top, which is usually referred to as peak power output, or peak concentric power, or mean concentric power, depending on how you measure. And it will be in watts. So this curve tells me something, just by looking at it, at the very beginning, it tells me something very, very interesting. That if I look at this area of the curve, or if I look at this area of the curve, down here, so here my force is very, very high, right? If I pick any point on the curve here, my force is very, very high. If I pick any point on the curve here, my velocity is very, very high. Can you give me an example of exercise that have high velocity or high force, like very, very high force or very, very high velocity? What's an exercise that requires a whole lot of force?
Clean.
Even more so.
Sprinting.
Force, just sheer ground reaction force. Load,
Jumping.
more than that.
Deadlift?
Any powerlifting movement, any type of powerlifting-ish movement with a load greater than 85% of warrior max. So our strength training goes right here, at the very bottom here. It's very heavy, it's very slow, produces a lot of ground reaction force. What goes here? High velocity. Give me an example of an exercise with very high shortening velocity. throwing, or even more so, anything that is plyometric, like a pogo jump, is super reactive, super quick. So here we have our like fast plyo. Okay? So by looking at this, I can see that everything that requires a lot of force produces very, very little power, and everything that requires a lot of velocity produces very, very little power. So we can spend a day on this, but just to make it simple, if I'm trying to improve power, there's one law that we all have to comply in physiology, which says adaptation is specific to imposed demand. If I want to improve power, I need to train power. If I'm not training power, I'm not improving power. So am I improving power with powerlifting? Absolutely not. Far from it. I can lift heavy as long as I want, my power output is not going to go up by much. It's going to go up at the beginning, but then it's going to be short-lived. Same thing with fast plyometric. I need to start narrowing down the exercise that are more conducive to that power output, because that's my goal. That's the ultimate goal of my intervention. And what we know from literature is that the optimal load for power development, be careful with numbers here because you saw that last week in class, so you've seen it before, but we have numbers in the literature that says that your optimal load for power development is plus or minus 30% from the load, which for now I'm just going to use water and mass because it's easier to make the math, but it can be any measurement of load corresponding to peak power output. And we have that in the literature, 100%. And it applies to pretty much, I can give you hundreds of examples, it's always going to fall within the same range. And then we're going to make some math now to make it simple, okay? So let's take a back squat, okay? Barbell back squat. Have you read any literature on power development of back squat? Where do I get my peak power output on a back squat? Where am I the most explosive on a back squat? What load? What load would you expect to see? I would agree with 70% if you're looking at trained athletes, which usually are not included in meta-analysis and review. Usually the general population. So general population is about, if we look at load and velocity, we're looking at 50% of water max at roughly 1 meter per second. That's where I'm the most powerful on a squat. Okay? General population. And if I were to test a weightlifter, chances are they're going to be just as powerful as 70%. But this number is never going to change. Very slight, right? Like you can have a massive standard deviation on this, but a very tiny standard deviation of that. It's always going to be somewhere around 1 meter per second. So if I look at this simple formula right here, and this is just by studying isokinetic dynamometry. It has nothing to do with meta-analysis, nothing to do with training interventions. If I were to look at this, then I'll start from this load, the load corresponding to my peak power output. And then what I'll do, I'll either take this 50% and multiply that times 0.7, so I'm taking 30% away from it, or I'll take that 50% and multiply that times 1.3, I'm adding that 30%. And that gives me a range of load where I actually am training for power. And that happens to be somewhere between 30 and 60% on water max. This is just from dynamometry. We haven't even studied anyone training yet, just by looking at the mechanics of muscle contraction. Now, you don't have to trust me, you go home and you look at Soriano, 2012, the most cited, the most extensive meta-analysis on optimal load for power development, only looking at interventions, not looking at studies of muscle mechanics anymore, just what people have done to make athletes more powerful. It'll tell you that the optimal load for power is 30 to 60% of water max. So numbers always add up. Whether we look at the mechanics of muscle contraction or what we do in training, that's the optimal load for power development. And that's kind of where we want to stay in when we look at our training intervention. We're going to break that down way more than this. This is just the beginning. So far, so good? Any questions so far? So when I look at this curve, I'm not saying that you have to ignore what's on the outside, but you're going to be focusing more on a much narrower range of loading conditions. Now we're going to break it down more into exercises. So what I can do first, I can split this curve in half. And I'll ask you, if I'm moving on the left side of this curve, am I looking at more force-oriented movement or more velocity-oriented movements? On the left side? Force. So force is the dominant feature on this side. if we think of force, with the only exception being isometric, what type of muscle contractions are produce more and more force besides isometric? Concentric. So I'm mostly looking at concentric type of exercises, and usually if I want to scale the intensity, I scale it as a percentage of what I max. So I move along this curve, there, my squat, my deadlift, my bench press, and what have you. On this side is mostly velocity, so I'm trying to get to that power output by means of faster shortening velocity. What is the most common type of muscle contraction where I can produce the highest amount of velocity? Velocity. Do I jump higher on a squat jump or a counter movement jump? Squat jump is concentric. What is a counter movement jump? Is eccentric concentric, and that's called? What type of muscle contraction is that? Plyometric. Rapid eccentric and concentric. So here I'm looking at mostly plyometric muscle contractions. And in theory, I'm not scaling your intensity as a percentage of water max. I should scale it in terms of the velocity of the sarcomere, which is very difficult to measure. So we consider everything in terms of ground contact time. How much time I spend on the ground.
Question with the like for the back, going back to the back squat, in terms of the 30% to 60%, is it also based on like the repetitions? Is that?
We're going to get to repetitions later on. So this is just an example, so that range can change. But this rule applies to any exercise. So if you were to Olympic weightlifting, power output is somewhere around 85. So the optimal training load is 70 to 90. Applies to every exercise. Anyone works with throwers here? Track and field throwers? Yeah? So throwers off season, they have their competition weights and they throw something lighter and something heavier. That heavier lighter is scaled based on this percentage. It's never going to be drastically heavier or drastically lighter. It's going to be within that plus or minus 30%. So it applies to all sports. Any sports applies the same principles. Okay, so we have two different halves of the curve. Here, in this zone right here, I'm training for power because we set specific adaptation to impose demand. But I'm training for power, focusing on force mostly. How do we refer to the exercise that fall under that category? There's a name that you find on blogs, books, textbooks. For a category of exercise that develops power by means of increasing force at a high velocity. How do we call that? Call that strength speed. On this side, I'm getting to the same outcome. I'm still training for power, but now I'm getting there by means of increasing velocity. So we call it speed strength. Strength speed is not strength training. Strength training is here. It's power development with an emphasis on force. Strength speed strength is not a pogo jump. It's intense plyometric with an emphasis on velocity. So if I look at power, and I can give you like, it's force times velocity, right? I can pick any random number, let's say 9 watts. That's the power I'm producing. I can get to that 9 as 9 times 1, still gives me 9. And now my predominant feature of my effort requires force. Or I can get there as 1 times 9. So now I'm focusing more on velocity. Still 9. Or I can get there as 3 times 3. Still gives me 9, which would be my optimal load where everything is balanced. So when I'm looking at strength speed and speed strength, I'm still looking at power development. It's just where I choose to put my emphasis on, either force or velocity. So far so good? Any questions?
So you could split, you could have like just for a quick example for speed strength and strength speed.
Yeah.
They're going to be very close together. Let's say like I
They're
said.
going to merge.
Yeah.
There's going to be a fold merge.
Yeah. Like on Tuesday, I want to focus on strength speed. Like the weight could look very similar to on Thursday if I want to work on speed strength. It's just the intent or the cueing of the exercise could look a little bit different. I mean, their outputs are good. Like if you're using a VBT device, like it's going to be a little bit slower for strength speed, and the goal is going to be to produce more force, so increase weight, like put more weight on the bar. Versus like on Thursday, if I want to work on speed strength, I might put less emphasis on how much weight is on the bar, but put more emphasis on make sure you're in this like specific speed zone, like if you're using like a DBT type situation. It's more of like the emphasis, like one day it's more like weight on the bar, one day it's more how fast the bar is moving type of situation.
To an extent, but I would, for now, DBT starts and ends in this side of the curve. Here needs to be plyometrics. Plyometric. If you're working on speed strength proper, it needs to be plyometric, which means you're looking at DBT here, and you're looking at loaded jumps here. There is going to be a point where the two perfectly converge to top. Like you get to a point where if you look at someone doing the exercise, it looks like a squat jump. You can't tell the difference. It's just whether it's a little heavier or a little faster. At the very top of it. Where it makes the biggest difference though, we'll talk about that in a second, is not at the top, it's right in this middle part of the curve, which is the most important one, and there you're looking at two completely different type of interventions. We're gonna get there in a second. You can doing speed strength with DBT, it's just not the optimal solution. Okay? Any questions so far? Now the very last piece of information that we need to put everything together that we're going to program design. Two things, and then we have to fill out this curve. So my goal is to increase peak power output. That's the goal that I set myself up at the beginning of the lecture. If you look at, so I want this point to go up. That's my only goal. I want that point to come as high as possible. If you look at the literature for many, many years, decades, people have asked the same identical question. So I have two different ways of going about it. I have heavy resistance training, which is everything down here. I have plyo, which is everything down here. And people wonder, is it one better than the other, or the combination is going to give me better results? Which one is going to get me more powerful? And they've looked at that for decades, at least, that I can remember, 20 or 25 meta-analysis on that. So imagine how many studies have done to compare the two. And they all point in the same identical direction. The combination of heavy resistance training and plyo is going to be the one that's going to give me the greatest development for power. Does that make sense? What people usually don't tell you, or they don't focus enough on those papers, is that these two are not the same. You can't say like plyo resistant training is best, but heavy resistant training or plyometric training are the same. You're only going to see if you were to choose one or the other, and you want to increase power, your only option is heavy resistant training. Plyometric does not improve power. That's what whoever told you that plyometrics improves power lied. There's not a single piece of evidence that shows that plyometric training improves power. Because plyometric training is going to end to create any adaptation when you're no longer getting stronger. So if you were to pick one or the other, it would be strength training. Then if you combine them, awesome. But plyometrics improves stiffness, power endurance, coordination, reaction time, but no power. So if your athlete needs to run faster and all you do is plyometric, you're going to get adaptation for 4 to 6 weeks, and that's going to be the end of it. If you remove strength training, everything is falling apart. Does that make sense? But the combination is always going to be the best one. Now, always think about physiology. So here we have force and velocity. Here we have force and time, which if you combine them, that's exactly the rate of force development. A change in force over time. You guys have done isometric tests before, right? Any type of isometric test with that and they're okay. The curve looks something like this. Goes up, shakes for a little bit, and then it comes down. You seen that before? Okay. So we have a point here, which is my peak isometric force, and I have the time corresponding to that. That's my time to peak force. Okay? How much time I need to get to peak force. Right? Okay. What would I expect that time to be? What's a good time to peak force? Give an estimate.
Under a second.
Under a second, guys. So we're looking at roughly 300 to 500 milliseconds for single joint. We're looking at 900 to 1500 milliseconds for multi-joint. Okay? So 300 milliseconds if you're doing like a leg extension, that would be awesome. 900 milliseconds would be exceptional if you're doing a squat. Like you're really moving really, really fast. So single joint versus multi-joint. If I were to draw rate of force development, where does rate of force development fall on that curve? What's my rate of force development? Is the first derivative of force calculated over time. So it's the slope of that curve. I can pick any point, the slope of that curve, that's my rate of force development, which is the end of that straight line. So this angle right here, that's my rate of force development. The angle of that slope is my rate of force development. Does that make sense so far? And I can move that point up or down, and that slope is going to change. Okay? So if we look at, and I'm going to list maybe a few here. Maffioletti, I think it was 2012. Del Vecchio, 2019. And if you want to go a little bit back, it would be Folland, 2009, I remember. Those are the three biggest names you need to research if you want to learn about rate of force development. Those papers don't even mention the word strength and conditioning. Those are purely either physiology or neurophysiology. So they're just looking at rate of force development. But what we learn from studying rate of force development is that this curve can be divided into three main areas, three big chunks. The very bottom part of the curve, which means like the force that I produce within the first 50 milliseconds of a muscle contraction, that's called early rate of force development. It usually goes between 0 and 50 milliseconds from the onset of muscle contraction. If you are purist, if you look at these papers, they will tell you 0 to 35 milliseconds because they're using isokinetic dynamometry, which has a sampling frequency of 2000 Hertz, so they can sample smaller time intervals. The majority of devices that were available in the force plates, they capture at 1000 Hertz. So it would be impossible to capture that short of a period of time. So we usually stretch that time a little bit more to 50 milliseconds. But it's still rate of force development. Top here, we have late rate of force development. And that goes from 0 to 250 milliseconds. So much, much longer period of time. In between, we usually refer to as rate of force development max, because my max rate of force development happens somewhere in between. And it usually goes between 0 and 150. The reason why we need to know this is because, that's why these papers are so important. Because looking at, you guys know what evoked muscle contractions are? When you have like electrical stimulation that forces you to contract and see how much torque you can produce, and then you compare that to your normal torque. Yeah, by studying imposed muscle contractions, we were able to determine per segment of the curve what is the physiological quality that is going to affect that area of the curve more than anything else. And what they found out is that it's quite different along that curve. If you look at late rate of force development, the main physiological feature that affects that side of the curve is your muscle cross-sectional area. Nothing else. So the amount of force that you can produce. If you want to produce a lot of power where you have very long ground contact time, you need much bigger muscles. That's what it means. Bring it down to practice. How long is it? Remember we talked about ground contact time earlier? What's the ground contact time in a sprint compared to like a throw? What's the ground contact time of sprinting? Anywhere between 80 to 120 milliseconds, maybe 140 milliseconds. So it's very rapid. It falls more in this early rate of force development of the curve. What's the ground contact time on a throwing, like when you throw like a javelin or a shot put? 240, 280 milliseconds. In weightlifting, 200 milliseconds for the second pull. If you look at a complete change of direction, meaning you're coming, you're stopping, you're sprinting in the opposite direction, 400 milliseconds. The longer the ground contact time, the more muscle cross-sectional area you need to be good at your sport. That's why throwers are much bigger than sprinters. That's why a running back has much bigger muscle than a wide receiver. Because the way they move on the field is different. The requirements are different. Does that make sense? If they want to be better, a longer, more powerful efforts, they need to have more muscles. There's no way around it. Does that make sense? If we look at early rate of force development, the only element contributing to early rate of force development is what they usually indicate as MUR, which stands for motor unit recruitment, or like how you recruit your muscles. However, that breaks down into 3 different segments. It's spatial recruitment, so how many motor units you can recruit, temporal recruitment, how fast you can recruit them, and discharge rate, how quick your brain is firing at every single contraction. And the most important one is discharge rate, which means that it means absolutely nothing how big your muscles are. If you can't fire at a very high frequency, you can't produce all of the power. Does that make sense? Okay. So far, so good? So that's where the lecture comes in. Because so far, people can easily assume that I'm working with athlete that requires a lot of like high velocity movements. I can just focus on this side of the curve and just focus on this. Or I'm working with more powerful athletes, I should just focus on that. The point is, the majority of the athletes we work with live in this space right here. Max rate of force development, soccer, baseball, volleyball, majority of track and field events, general population, they all work in this environment right here. And what we know about this curve is that there's a very, very distinctive feature. My rate of force development is going to go up, and right around 80 milliseconds, so right between these 2 zones, is either going to plateau or start sinking. And the only way I can keep that line to continue going up, so the only element contributing to my RFD max is how quick my sarcomere can keep up with that velocity muscle contraction, which is indicated as CBCR, cross bridge cycling rate, how quickly my sarcomere can produce force. And that depends on only one feature, which is the ratio between my fast twitch and my slow twitch. That's the only thing that is going to determine how well I can produce rate of force development. And that is only genetic. You can't change it. You can't change that. You can take a slow twitch muscle fiber, which is predominantly aerobic, and make it anaerobic, but it's not going to become fast. It's just going to become more tolerant for anaerobic efforts. You can take a fast twitch muscle fiber and make it more aerobic. It's still going to be very fast, but it's going to tolerate more work. If it's low, it's low. If it's fast, it's fast. It's genetic. So I can't really train this area. Bottom line, the only way I can get to bigger rate of force development is if I focus on my early rate of force development. The steeper the curve at the beginning, I know it's going to come down eventually, the more force I'm going to be able to produce over time. Does that make sense? So far, so good? Which means, if we know what the physical determinants are, so cross-sectional area for my late rate of force development, and discharge rate for my early rate of force development, I can pinpoint with absolute certainty what is the type of training intervention that is going to be the most beneficial. Here is my heavy resistance training. So I got it. It's right here. I got that. I need that if I want to get to this one. But what that's telling me is that even more important is my plyo. Because to improve discharge rate, I can only work on plyometric training. So no matter what athletes you're working with, you can't do strength and conditioning unless you include plyometric training. Does that make sense? So it is true that strength training is always the most important feature because it's what's driving adaptation. But if I don't include plyo, I'm gonna get a whole lot stronger, but not that much more explosive. I can eliminate plyometric from my programs. People understand physiology, take that for granted. Lots of coaches look at like powerlifting, weightlifting, track and field, some ask like throwers for instance. They never do plyo because they don't think they need it. Without plyo, there would be no steeper rate of force development, there would be no power production. So you can be as strong as you want, but if you don't include those ballistic elements to it, you're not gonna get that much better. Does that make sense? So far so good? That was all the science behind it. Now we go down to program design. Any questions so far? Does that make sense or you're... Okay.
I was wondering if there's any literature out there on the master athlete aging population in terms of that power curve. How does it change? Does it just fall? Does it narrow? Does it flatten out? And like what
It shifts.
configuration? It shifts.
It shifts this way. So it becomes more reliant on cross-sectional area. Because atrophy, or muscle waste, call it whatever you want it, tends to enter into dominant and fast-twitch muscle fibers, which means that you're going to get less power output, with bigger motor recruitment is going to be slower. Ultimately, it's going to be slower.
Yeah.
Unless you train it. That's why if you look at the modern protocols, they're no longer focusing on, if you look at call it training the master athlete, 20 years ago, it was all about hypertrophy, just to prevent the muscle waste.
Right.
Now we know that if we do work on hypertrophy, what we end up doing is we promote increasing muscle mass and fast twitch muscle fiber, but also slow twitch muscle fiber, which is exactly the opposite of what we want in the aging population. So now it tends to be more like fast, dynamic, ballistic training to try to keep that curve from moving too slow. So, DBT has been researched quite a lot now for the older population. Not DBT proper the way we want to do it here, but isokinetic type of interventions where there's higher velocity. Because otherwise that curve would come down, it will shift to the left a lot. No problem. Any more questions? Go for it. Can I cancel the whiteboard in the meantime so I can make space for next? Yeah? You guys. Picture, sorry. It's messy. When you,
I like messy.
thank you. Ben, you and I get along together very well.
Can you speak a little bit to, and maybe this is a question, but like shifting between speed strength and strength speed, maybe what makes this program
Okay.
designed for, let's say, like figure?
Oh, 100%. This is just the beginning. We haven't even talked about programming yet. That's the best part of it. We just need to make sure that we agree on what matters, and this is what matters. Okay? Power, and now we get there's a combination. We can't eliminate plyo, but the driving force will always be force. If we agree on that, now everything that we do in program design will make sense. Good?
Quick, maybe not a quick question, maybe we'll get to it later, but if that cross-sectional area is so important for that late rate of force development, we work with a lot of post-op ACL patients, so
Yeah.
that cross-sectional area evaporates, right?
Yeah.
Muscle goes away. At some point, if we're finding that their force output is equal on both sides, but we're noticing that the muscle girth is still different, are we basically saying at some point your rate of force development is not the same and we're just not able, like maybe as clinicians we're not looking at it closely enough to see that there's a difference? Like one leg's bigger than the other leg?
I think you already gave yourself the answer because you said muscle girth and force. So we usually, I don't measure because I'm not a physical therapist, but we measure the size of the muscle because we know that size of the muscle is a good approximation of how strong those muscles are. But if you find yourself doing, that's not my opinion, I'm just referring what's the current best practice in rehabilitation. If you, let's say, test left and right leg, and your muscle size is significantly different, meaning like maybe you have a cover on one side but not enough to match the other, but then you go and test the peak isometric force, and that peak isometric force is similar, you're good. Muscle mass is no longer a concern. It's just back in the days when those measurement of force were more difficult to access, it was easier to just look at muscle girth. Does that make sense?
Yes.
If you want to do something even better, you should be able to measure rate of force development and see where you're at, because that's going to be the ultimate target. The problem is that for you to be able to do that, you have to have access to devices that are not very common, like clinical setting, and with all due respect for Volt. But the dynamometer that you can use, commercial dynamometry, they give you a very good estimate of the peak rate of force development, but for anything on the curve, where it's like 50, 100, 250, they don't really capture that. So you won't be able to measure it.
What, like you're talking about like a Cybex machine?
Not a science machine. That would be the only way to be extremely accurate in the way you address that. In the absence of that, peak isometric force will always be your go-to. And dynamometry does it, like any dynamometer will do that very well. Does that make sense? Yes. Okay. Any more questions? Okay, I'm gonna go right into it. So now we focus